Hello, my name is Eric Lowe. My ID number is 0314928, and this is my first video response for U.S. history through Reconstruction. So starting with the first question, in your own words, summarize these two primary sources and explain why you feel they are significant. So starting with the first primary source, John Easton documents causes of the King's Philip War. In New England, King Philip was a Native American king named Metacom. So this, as discussed in the key term lecture, this name of King Philip was kind of given facetiously to Metacom as kind of mocking him, comparing him to a great leader. It was not given to him because they truly thought he was a good leader. It was kind of sarcastic. So Metacom details the relationship between the English settlers, and he explains the various forms of mistreatment by the English. Metacom, in this document, seems he hoped to come to an agreement with the English settlers before an eventual war. So in New England, Native Americans had lost a lot of land and were getting increasingly fed up with the treatment from the English settlers. So eventually, this leads to a war. The catalyst for this war is the death of John Sassaman, which is also discussed in the key term lecture. So John Sassaman was a praying Indian who was a mediator between the native people and English. So Metacom felt as though this investigation was done unfairly and should have been handled by the native people since it happened on their land. So this leads to attacks from the native people against the English settlers, and at first the native people are successful, though later on they start to run out of gunpowder since the English controlled the gunpowder. And eventually the English, with the help of other native allies, overcame Metacom and put his head on a post outside of Plymouth Colony. So this was a major blow to native sovereignty and led to an increase in racism against native people. It also led to the English starting to expand more westward. Now, for the second primary source, Bacon's Declaration of the People against Sir William Berkeley. So this is a declaration from Nathaniel Bacon against Sir William Berkeley, calling him out for his corruption. So in Virginia, Sir William Berkeley was a corrupt governor and used his power to enrich those around him. Virginia was known for growing tobacco, and Sir William Berkeley was giving a lot of the land to grow tobacco to his friends. He was also preserving the land, not letting people expand outside of Virginia because he was profiting off of the trade furs from the native people who were outside of Virginia. So he didn't want to disrupt this relationship he had with the native people who he was getting these furs from. So Nathaniel Bacon naturally did not like that William Berkeley was giving his land to his friends so they could farm tobacco. He also did not like that people were being prevented from expanding outside of Virginia to help preserve the fur trade that William Berkeley was also profiting from. So eventually, Nathaniel Bacon gathered up support against this corruption. He used both poor white people and poor black people. Kind of became a clash between the haves and the have-nots. So Nathaniel Bacon wanted to take the native land outside of Virginia and turn it into farmland so they too could profit from the tobacco trade in Virginia. So this rebellion was largely successful and forced William Berkeley to move back to London, although his allies in Virginia remained in power. So again, as discussed in the key term lecture, his allies recognized that Bacon's rebellion was largely successful because it united poor people under one banner, despite the racial differences. So in order to prevent this happening in the future, they instituted laws that created a separation between poor white people and poor black people. This led people to identifying more with their race than the class they were in, and these laws gave poor white people an idea of superiority over black people. This kind of laid, as discussed in the key term lecture, this kind of laid the foundation for modern racism and people not identifying with their class and rather with their race. So next question is, what are two direct quotes from each document that stood out to you and why? So from the first primary source about King Philip's War, two quotes that stood out to me were, "We said we knew the English said the Indians wronged them, and the Indians said the English wronged them." But our desire was the quarrel might rightly be decided in the best way, and not as dogs decided their quarrels. The Indians owned that fighting was the worst way. For the second quote, and another grievance was, if 20 of their honest Indians testified that an Englishman had done them wrong, it was as nothing. But if one of their worst Indians testified against any Indian or their king, when it pleased the English, it was sufficient. I think this quote highlights the native people want to resolve these issues without having to go to war. I believe the native people, at least during this time or before war broke out, wanted to generally try to coexist with these English settlers and deal with this new reality. Though I think the English settlers looked at the native people as more of an impingement to their ability to profit off this expansion. I think this really highlights, a difference in the cultures, that English settlers were more focused on themselves and their goals, while the native people wanted to find a way to live with these new settlers. For the second quote, I think this highlights the lopsided negotiation that the native people were dealing with. True negotiation and compromise requires both parties to be operating in somewhat of a good faith. The English settlers, I don't think, were operating in good faith. I believe that they were just trying to postpone the inevitable and appease the Indians in the short term, while I think the native people were genuinely trying to negotiate in good faith to coexist with the English settlers. I think the English settlers looked at the native people as more of an obstacle to their expansion and ability to profit off of the resources in America. So for a couple quotes from the secondary primary source, two quotes that stood out to me were, for having abused and rendered contemptible his mates justice by advancing the places of judicer, scandalous, and ignorant favors. For the second quote, desiring a firm union against ourselves, that West may jointly and with one accord defend ourselves against the common enemy. Let not the faults of guilty be the reproach of the innocent, or the faults and crimes of oppressors. Divide and separate us who have suffered by their oppression. So I think, similar to the last two quotes from the previous source, I chose these quotes because they kind of go hand in hand. So the first quote highlights the injustice and unfairness under William Berkeley. How the common people of Virginia, they kind of had the deck stacked against them and were opposing from a position of little power. And I think the second quote highlights how opposing from a position of little power can actually bring people together despite their backgrounds. And obviously, as I mentioned before and in the key term lecture, the people in power's reaction to this unification was to create a divide using race, trying to create, artificial divides. So this would not happen in the future. Discuss a key term from the lecture and that you feel adds context to these primary source documents. So I think obviously the two terms from the key term lecture that is most relevant to these two primary sources is Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War. Both these sources are from these terms, and these two sources kind of add context, using firsthand accounts of these events and captured how major figures felt during these events. So for the final question, speak more broadly about the various crises in New England and Virginia during the 1670s. What were their causes? Why were they significant? And to what extent were these situations and outcomes in New England and Virginia similar or different? So I think obviously they were significant because it kind of laid the foundation for the rest of the expansion into the Americas. Bacon's Rebellion was significant because those in power identified that people of a lower class identifying with each other was a threat, so they kind of created artificial divides using race. King Philip's War was also significant because it led to increased racism, led to the English expanding more westward into the Americas. And for similarities, I would say that both of these events were struggles between those in power and those not in power. So in Bacon's Rebellion, it was poor white people, poor black people, identifying with each other and opposing those who were in power. In King's Philip War, it was the native people who were opposing the English. Obviously the way these were different was Bacon's rebellion was poor white people and poor black people opposing those in power, and King's Philip War was native people opposing those in power. So I think that's how these were similar, and different at the same time. And for that concludes my video. Thank you for listening. I hope I didn't ramble too much. Have a nice day.